1994 connector, and this is also known as FireWire. FireWire is recognized by its D shape. This type of connection is becoming more popular on desktops and laptops, and is commonly associated with attaching peripheral devices such as digital cameras and printers rather than being used as network connections. These are also found on many types of video and multimedia devices. Now we're getting into fiber optic connectors. And this connector is called the MTRJ, which stands for Mechanical Transfer Register Jack. And this is a fiber optic cable connector. It uses a latched push-pull connection, and it has a small form factor used for high packed density. Our next fiber optic connector is called the ST, or straight tip. This uses a half-twist bayonet type of lock, and is commonly used with single-mode fiber optic cable. And our next connector is called the LC, or local connector. And this is also a fiber optic connector. It uses a jack similar to the RJ45. This type of connector is commonly used between floors in a building. And our last fiber optic connector is called the SC, or standard connector. And this uses a push-pull connector similar to audio and video plugs. And like the LC connector, this is also commonly used between floors in a building. The term serial refers to sending data one bit at a time. Serial cables are cables that carry serial data transmission, and the most common form of serial cables use the RS-232 standard, which uses the common D connectors, such as the DB9 and DB25. Now we're going to talk about the difference between UPC and APC connectors. And as an example, we're going to use a group of ST fiber connectors equipped with UPC and APC connectors. When fiber optic connectors make a connection to each other, the point at which the connection is made is not perfect because of the small imperfections of the surfaces. So what happens is at the point where the connectors join, light is transmitted from one connector to the other connector, but at that point where light passes to the other connector, light will reflect back in the opposite direction towards the light source. And as this happens, there is signal loss. This is what happens in a UPC connector. Light is reflected directly back. So as technology progressed, a new connector was developed to decrease this signal loss. And this is called the APC connector. The difference between the UPC and the APC is the angle of the tip where the connection is made. With the UPC, the light reflects back towards the light source. But with the APC, with its angled connection, the light doesn't reflect back towards the light source. It reflects back at an angle into the wall of the cable. And as a result, this greatly reduces the signal loss. The term plenum refers to a space in a building where there is open air flow circulation. And this is usually between the drop ceiling and the structure ceiling. Buildings that don't have plenum spaces have air ducts encapsulating the airflow. So as a result, buildings that have plenum spaces where there is adequate open air flow are more prone to fires than buildings that don't have plenum spaces. And because of this, cables that run through plenum spaces must meet certain requirements. First, they must be more fire resistant, and secondly, they must not produce any toxic fumes if they are burned. The IEEE 1901-2013 standard is called Ethernet over HDMI. The HDMI 1.4 specification adds another channel to an HDMI cable for data that will have the capability of network communication. So the connected devices that use this feature will have the ability to send and receive data at 100 megabits per second Ethernet. So in addition to video and audio on a single cable, the HDMI cable will have another ability of Ethernet networking. Sometimes there might be cases in your home or office where you wanted a certain computer in a certain part of the building to be able to access the internet or to be networked. And for whatever reason, network cabling or Wi-Fi just wasn't an option in that part of the building. Maybe because of difficulties in the structure of the building or interference or whatever. So another 1901 standard gave the ability to network using the existing electrical system of the building. Ethernet over power line gives this ability of Ethernet networking over power. So for example, let's say you needed this computer up here to be able to access the internet. But for some reason you can't get any network cables or any Wi-Fi signal to reach that computer. So in this case, we're going to use Ethernet over power. So we're going to need a couple of power line adapters like these. These power line adapters plug directly into a power outlet, and they have a built-in Ethernet port for an RJ45 connector. So one of them plugs into the power outlet next to this computer up here, and then you will connect an Ethernet cable from the network port of the computer and the other end into the power line adapter's Ethernet port. Then the other adapter plugs into the power outlet next to the modem or router down here. Then you would plug an Ethernet cable from the modem or router to the power line adapter. And now Ethernet data will use the building's electrical wiring to deliver networking data to the other power line adapter so that the other computer can access the internet. Today, there are many different cable standards that are used on networks. These cables are categorized and named according to their speed, type, and media. So here is one example. Here is a cable called 10 base T. 10 stands for the maximum speed of this cable. The maximum speed of this cable is 10 megabits per second. Base stands for baseband transmission, and T stands for twisted pair cable. 10 base 2, which is also referred to as thin Ethernet, is a version of Ethernet that uses coaxial cable as opposed to unshielded twisted pair cabling. It has a maximum speed of 10 megabits per second and has a maximum length of 200 meters. Other cable standards include 100 base T, and this, as the name states, has a speed of 100 megabits per second, which is 10 times faster than 10 base T. This uses category 5 UTP cable or higher, and it also has a maximum length of 100 meters. 100 base T is also known as fast Ethernet. 100 base FX, just like 100 base T, has a speed of 100 megabits per second. But the difference is that FX uses fiber optic cable, where 100 base T uses copper cabling. It has a maximum length of 400 meters in half duplex mode and 2 kilometers in full duplex mode. And moving on to the gigabit standards, there is 1000 base T, and this has a speed of 1000 megabits per second. It uses category 5 UTP cabling or higher, and has a maximum length of 100 meters. 1000 base TX is similar to 1000 base T, with the exception that it was supposed to be an easier setup because it only uses 2 unidirectional pairs of wires for communication, whereas 1000 base T uses 4 bidirectional wires. But 1000 base TX never caught on and is known as a failure in commercial implementation. Moving on to the 10 gigabit standard, there is 10G base T. And this has a speed of 10,000 megabits per second or 10 gigabits per second. It was developed in 2006 and it uses both shielded and unshielded twisted pair cabling. It has a maximum distance of 100 meters when using Category 6A cabling, or if it's using Category 6, it has a maximum length of 55 meters. Next is 10G base SR, where the SR stands for short range. This is a commonly used multi-mode fiber optic specification and has a maximum length of 300 meters. 10 base ER, or extended reach, and this has a longer range of 40 kilometers using single-mode fiber optics. 10G base SW has the same specification as 10G base SR, but this is specifically used to operate over SONET, which is synchronous optical networks. Now, a firewall can be either software or hardware. It is a system that is designed to prevent unauthorized access from entering a private network by filtering the information that comes in from the internet. It blocks unwanted traffic and permits wanted traffic. So basically, it filters the incoming network data packets and determines by its access rules if it is allowed to enter the network. In today's high-tech world, a firewall is essential to every business to keep their network safe. And one way that a firewall controls the flow of traffic coming into and out of a network is through its Access Control List, or ACL. And the ACL is a list of rules on what can access the network. It either allows or denies permission. So as an example, here we have a very simplified ACL with a list of IP addresses that have been allowed or denied on this firewall. So if this IP address tried to get into this network, the firewall will deny it because of the rules that are set in the ACL. But these other IP addresses are granted access because the ACL allows them. Most firewalls come with a default rule of implicit deny. And what that basically means is that the firewall will only allow traffic to enter the network that the ACL specifically says that it will allow. So as an example, if your ACL only has one rule, and let's say that that rule has allowed port number 80, which is web pages, then that means that you'll be allowed to access web pages on your network, but nothing else. You won't be able to use any FTP, HTTPS, or incoming POP or IMAP email because the firewall has implicitly denied those ports. So the only way to access those services is you have to specifically allow them by granting them access in the ACL. So for example, we'll go ahead and add port 25 and port 110 and give those ports access to the network. And now those ports, along with their respective service, are able to go through the firewall, but everything else is implicitly denied. Firewalls come in different types, and one type is called a host-based firewall. And this is a software firewall. This is the kind of firewall that is installed on a computer, and it protects that computer only and nothing else. For example, later versions of Microsoft operating systems come pre-packaged with a host-based firewall, as you can see here. You can turn the firewall on or off if you want, and you can also create exceptions to the firewall based on the application name on the Exceptions tab. And of course, you can always purchase a third-party firewall and install it on your computer. Another type of firewall is called a network-based firewall, and this is the kind that is shown here. A network-based firewall is a combination of hardware and software, and it operates at the network layer. It is placed between a private network and the internet. And unlike a host-based firewall, where it only protects its own computer, a network-based firewall protects an entire network. And it does this through management rules that is applied to the entire network so that any harmful activity can be stopped before it reaches the computers. Firewalls also inspect traffic in a couple of different ways, and one way is called stateful. A stateful firewall monitors all the connections and data streams that are passing through and keeps a record of it. It uses the connection information that comes from the applications and previous sessions and factors that in allowing or denying the flow of data packets. It does a thorough job of protecting a network dynamically. A stateless firewall, on the other hand, does not do a thorough job as a stateful firewall does. A stateless firewall uses an access control list to allow or deny traffic. It does not thoroughly inspect a data packet. It only looks into the header portion of the data packet, and it does not keep a record of previous data packets. Content filtering is a technology that is commonly used in email, and as its name implies, it filters data based on their content and not on the source. This type of filter is commonly used to filter email spam. And another type of filter is called signature identification, and this is used to detect viruses that have a well-known behavior pattern. Certain viruses and malware have a common behavior, and firewalls that use signature identification are programmed to spot this behavior. And once it's spotted, it takes action to block the intruder. Intrusion detection or prevention system is a hardware tool that is typically placed between the internet and the firewall, and its job is to alert and prevent a network from outside attacks. These attacks include viruses, malware, and hackers who are trying to sabotage an internal network. It monitors traffic flowing through a network looking for suspicious patterns, and if it finds any, it alerts the network administrator of a pending danger. The terms 568A and 568B refer to a set of wiring standards developed by TIA/EIA, which is also known as the Telecommunications Industry Association. And these terms define the rules on how twisted pair cables should be wired to RJ45 connectors. And these wires must follow a certain order so that the network can function properly. The 568A standard is wired in this order: white-green, then green, white-orange, blue, white-blue, orange, white-brown, and brown. And the 568B standard is wired in the following order: white-orange, then orange, white-green, blue, white-blue, green, white-brown, and brown. There is no difference in the functionality as to which standard is used. Whether you choose to use the A or B wiring standard, if both ends of the cable are wired using the same standard, then this is known as a straight cable. For example, this cable is wired on both ends using the 568A standard. A straight cable allows signals to pass straight through from end to end. And this is the most common type of cable, and it is used to connect computers to hubs, switches, or modems. Another type of cable is called a crossover. And this cable is created when both ends of the cable are wired using the two different standards. For example, one end is wired using the A standard, and the other end is wired using the B standard. Crossover cables are used to connect two similar devices together. For example, you can use a crossover cable to connect two computers directly to each other without using a hub or a switch. Crossover cables are also used to connect hubs or switches to each other. A rollover cable is created when both ends are wired completely opposite of each other. These are used to connect a computer or a terminal to a router's console port. And a loopback cable is for testing purposes. It's to make a computer think that it's connected to a network. And to make a loopback cable, you connect pin 1 to pin 3 and pin 2 to pin 6. Today, there are 5 different categories of twisted pair cables that you're going to need to know for the exam. The difference between these is the maximum speed they can handle without having any crosstalk. The numbers of these categories represent the tightness of the twists that are applied to the wires. So category 3 has a maximum speed of 10 megabits per second, and this is an old category that was used on old 10 base T Ethernet networks. Category 5 has a maximum speed of 100 megabits per second, and these were used on 100 base T and TX Ethernet networks. Category 5E is an enhanced version of Category 5, and it has speeds of over 1000 megabits per second, and these are used on 1000 base T Ethernet networks. And Category 6 also has a maximum speed of 1000 megabits per second and is also used on 1000 base T Ethernet networks, but it's more of a heavier duty cable when compared to Category 5E. And it's also used on 10G base T networks, which has a max speed of 10,000 megabits per second, but only for cable lengths of less than 100 meters. And last, there's Category 6A, or augmented. And this has a maximum speed of 10,000 megabits per second, and is used on 10G base T networks. And unlike Category 6, this has a maximum length of 100 meters. Unshielded twisted pair is by far the most common type of cable that is used today. It consists of 4 pairs of unshielded wires twisted around each other. The wires are twisted to prevent electromagnetic interference or crosstalk. This type of cabling is mainly used on local area networks. Now, shielded twisted pair is very similar to unshielded twisted pair, except that it has a foil shield that covers the wires. This shielding adds a layer of protection against electromagnetic interference leaking into or out of the cable. This is a coaxial cable. This is used today primarily by cable providers to provide a computer with broadband internet connection. Early on, it was used as a backbone for networks, such as a bus network. Now, there are two common types of coaxial cable. The first type is RG6, and this is made for long distances and is commonly used for cable television and internet connection. And the second type is RG59, and this is made for short distances and is commonly used for high definition and high quality video. Now we're getting into fiber optic cables. And here is a cutaway view of a fiber optic cable and a light source. Fiber optic cable uses pulses of light to send data. And as a result, it is very fast and it can span for great distances. Now there are two different modes in fiber optics: single mode fiber and multi-mode fiber. Single mode fiber is a fiber optic cable that allows light to enter only at a single angle, as you can see here. So when this type of transmission of light enters at this angle, it can span for great distances. Now this is multi-mode fiber, and the difference between multi-mode and single mode is that in multi-mode, light travels in multiple beams that reflect off the walls of the cable. And unlike single-mode fiber, multi-mode fiber is made for short distances. Sometimes you may need to convert different media types in your network. So if you're running different types of media, such as fiber, Ethernet, or coaxial within your network, well then you can convert and connect all these different types by using a media converter. Media converters allows you to convert to different types of media, such as converting single and multi-mode fiber to Ethernet, fiber to coaxial, and single-mode fiber to multi-mode fiber, and so on. Another standard is called DOCSIS, which stands for Data over Cable Service Interface Specifications. And those of you who have broadband cable internet will recognize this device. And yes, this is your typical DOCSIS cable modem. The DOCSIS modem handles both incoming and outgoing data signals, including internet, video, and voice. The DOCSIS 3.1 specification supports speeds of 10 gigabit downstream and 1 gigabit upstream. A hub is a device that has multiple ports that accepts Ethernet connections from network devices. A hub is considered not to be intelligent because it does not filter any data or has any intelligence as to where data is supposed to be sent. When a data packet arrives at one of the ports, it is copied to all other ports. So all the devices on that hub sees that data packet. There are also two different types of hubs: passive and active. The difference is a passive hub does not require power, but an active hub does require power. Now a switch is very similar to a hub. It's also a device that has multiple ports that accepts Ethernet connections from network devices. But unlike a hub, a switch is intelligent. A switch can actually learn the physical addresses of the devices that are connected to it, and it stores these addresses in a table. So when a data packet is sent to a switch, it directs it only to the intended destination port. That's the major difference between a hub and a switch. So as a result, switches are far more preferred over hubs because they reduce any unnecessary traffic on the network. Regular switches operate at layer 2 of the OSI model, and we'll talk about the OSI model in a later lesson. But there are other types of switches that operate at higher levels of the OSI model, and one of these is called a multi-layer switch. A multi-layer switch can operate at layer 2 and layer 3 of the OSI model. It's able to interpret layer 3 data similar to a router. And another type of switch is called a content switch. And a content switch can operate at layers 4 through 7 of the OSI model. This type of switch can perform load balancing and advanced filtering, and these switches are also very expensive. Networking devices need electrical power to function, and that's why they have a separate electrical port for a power plug. But some networking devices don't have an electrical port. It's not that they don't need electrical power, it's just that they get their power and data from the same cable, which is through the Ethernet cable. And this technology is known as PoE, which stands for Power over Ethernet. Some networks are designed to be more fault tolerant. For example, in some networks, multiple switches are installed in case a switch does fail. So in a case of a failure, the data can bypass a failed switch and use the others to get to their destination. But a potential problem can happen with this setup, and that problem is with broadcast traffic loops. These loops can happen when there are multiple active paths between the destinations. And when this happens, it can slow down the network because of the excess traffic. So to solve this problem, the spanning tree protocol was created. The spanning tree protocol allows for fault tolerance and prevents unnecessary traffic loops in the network. And it does this by allowing the switches to talk to each other to find if loops are happening in the network. Bridges are used to divide a network into separate collision domains. For example, here we have a network, and this network is segmented into two by a couple of hubs. And if you notice, all the broadcast traffic from the two segments are seen by all the computers on both sides. And this causes unnecessary traffic. So that is where a bridge can be helpful. If you add a bridge to this network, it will reduce any unnecessary traffic between the two segments by filtering the data based on their MAC address. The bridge only allows data to cross over if it meets the required MAC address of the destination, because a bridge keeps a record of all the MAC addresses of the NICs that are connected to it, and it will also block all data from crossing over if it fails to meet this requirement. Now, a router does exactly what its name implies. A router is a device that routes or forwards data from one network to another based on their IP address. When a data packet is received from the router inspects the packet and determines if the packet was meant for its own network or if it's meant for another network. If the router determines that the data packet is meant for its own network, it receives it. But if it's not meant for its own network, it sends it off to another network. So a router is essentially the gateway for a network. Now let's go ahead and demonstrate this. Here we have a private network with its router, and we'll refer to this one as the red network, indicated by the red colored screens on the computers. And over here you're going to have different data packets, indicated by their various colors, and they are going to be entering the red network's router from the internet. The router is only going to accept the red data packets because they are the only ones that are intended for this network. So all of the other data packets, the yellows, blues, greens, etc., will be rejected by this router because they were not intended for this network. Now this is a very simplified illustration of how a router works, but I think you'll get the idea. Now here is an expanded view of routers over the internet. There are 4 networks here, indicated by their different colors, and each network has their own router. Now notice how the routers send data. Notice that when a computer wants to send data to another computer on the same network, the data packet never leaves their own network. The router would not let that happen because the router knows what belongs inside and outside their network. But on the other hand, when a computer wants to send data to another computer on a different network, the router allows it. For example, notice how the router on the red network allows the yellow, blue, and green data packets pass by so they can go to their intended destination. The yellow packet goes to the yellow network, the blue goes to the blue network, and so on. And the same goes for all the other networks. A gateway can be defined as a device that joins 2 networks together. They interconnect networks with different or incompatible communication protocols. A gateway, however, does not change the data. It only changes the format of the data. So in simple terms, this illustration is showing how a gateway is transforming a simple signal into something totally different. The circular pattern can represent one network, and as it goes through the gateway, it transforms into a wave pattern which represents a different network. Now this is a CSU-DSU. Now this is a device about the size of a modem, and what this does is that it converts data from a local area network to a wide area network. And this has to happen because the data formats between a LAN and a WAN are different. A network interface card, or NIC, is used to connect a computer to a network. It is basically a circuit board with a network adapter that is installed on your computer. And its job is to convert incoming serial data into parallel data so that the computer can understand it. A NIC provides a constant dedicated connection to a network. And every NIC has its own unique identifier called a MAC address. A transceiver is a device that has both a transmitter and a receiver in the same package. The term applies to wireless communication devices like cell phones and two-way radios. It's basically a term used for any device that receives data, converts it, then transmits the data to another location. A wireless access point is basically a wireless hub that is used by wireless devices. It connects to a wired network and relays data between the wired network and the wireless device for communication purposes. In this illustration, you see a wireless access point wired to a network so that the wireless laptop can communicate with the network. A dial-up modem is a device that allows a computer to transmit data over normal telephone lines. The data coming in from the telephone lines is analog. However, the data in a computer is all digital. So when the analog data comes in from the telephone lines, the modem's job is to convert it into a digital form so the computer can understand it. So that's basically what a modem does. It converts analog data into digital data. And the maximum speed of most modems today is 56 kbps. The IEEE is an international organization for the advancement of technology related to electricity. And they are responsible for a set of standards for a project called the 802 project. And one of these standards is the 802.11 standard, which is wireless. Wireless technology is becoming more and more popular, and today there are 5 wireless standards. There are the A, B, G, N, and AC standards. And here is a chart of the speed, frequencies, and release year for each one. Starting with the first wireless standard, which is 802.11a, which came out in 1999, and the latest standard is the 802.11ac standard, which was released in 2014. Infrared is a technology that was developed by IRDA, which stands for the Infrared Data Association. The term infrared actually means below red. It's a wireless technology where data is transmitted in rays of light, rather than using radio waves. Many companies have now utilized this technology to transmit and receive data in their products. However, the drawbacks of infrared is that it requires a direct line of sight. If any object comes in between the 2 infrared devices, the communication will be blocked. And also, infrared does not work in direct sunlight. If this happens, the communication will be weakened and most likely will be blocked. Bluetooth is a short-range radio that provides a way to connect and exchange information between devices such as laptops, cell phones, and tablets. It operates at 2.4 GHz and is capable of transmitting both voice and data. The latest standard in Bluetooth has a transfer speed of 24 megabits per second and has a maximum range of approximately 100 meters. Here is how you get the MAC address on the Windows computer. The MAC, or Media Access Control Address, is an identifier that every network device uses to uniquely identify itself on a network. So no 2 devices anywhere in the world has the same MAC address. It's made up of a 6-byte hexadecimal number that is burned into every NIC by its manufacturer. The MAC address can contain any number, and it also contains alphabets from A through F. The MAC address is broken up into 2 parts. The first 3 bytes of the MAC address identifies the manufacturer of the NIC, for example Linksys, Netgear, or Belkin. And the last 3 bytes are a unique number from the manufacturer that identifies each device on a network. In order for network communication to take place, there needs to be a set of standards, and that's why the OSI model was developed. The OSI model describes how information from software in one computer moves through a network to reach software in another computer. And it does this by breaking down this huge task of data communication into 7 different layers, giving control of the data being sent from one layer to another. And these layers are numbered from 1 to 7, starting from the bottom. These layers are the physical, data link, network, transport, session, presentation, and application. This illustration shows how data flows through the OSI model. When 2 computers want to communicate, the data flows down the OSI model, and when the data crosses over the network media, such as the internet, It flows back up the OSI model to its destination. The top layer of the OSI model is the application layer. And this layer, as you might have guessed, deals with applications. The purpose of this layer is to manage communications between applications. It supports application protocols such as email, HTTP, and FTP. At this layer, data still resembles something that you can actually read. The presentation layer is where data is first converted into a form that can be sent over a network. Data is compressed or decompressed and encrypted or decrypted. This layer is sometimes referred to as the translation layer. The session layer controls the dialogue during communications. It establishes, manages, and terminates the connections between local and remote applications. This layer is also known as the traffic cop because it directs network traffic. The transport layer provides the transfer of data between end users. It's responsible for resending any packets that do not receive an acknowledgement from the destination, ensuring that the data packets were received by the destination. This layer can guarantee that the packets are received. The network layer is responsible for routing the data packet based on its logical IP address. It fragments and reassembles the packets, and it instructs data on how to find its ultimate destination. The data link layer is responsible for sending data to the physical layer. Data packets are encoded and decoded into bits. It handles flow control and frame synchronization. And it's also divided into two sublayers: the media access control layer and the logical link control layer. The bottom of the OSI model is the physical layer, and this layer defines the network standards and physical characteristics of a network, such as the connectors, media types, cables, voltages, etc. This layer defines the topology of a network. An IP address is a numeric address. It's an identifier for a computer or device on a network. Every device has to have an IP address for communication purposes. The IP address consists of two parts. The first part is the network address, and the second part is the host address. There are also two types of IP addresses. The first one is the most common one. It's called IP version 4. And the second type is IP version 6. IP version 4 is the current version of IP addresses. It's a 32-bit numeric address written as 4 numbers separated by periods. Each group of numbers that are separated by periods is called an octet. The number range in each octet is 0 to 255. This address version can produce over 4 billion unique addresses. IP address 4 is made up of 4 sets of 8 binary bits, and these sets are called octets. The bits in each octet are represented by a number. So starting from the left, the first bit has a value of 128, then 64, then 32, and so on, all the way down to 1. Each bit on the octet can be either a 1 or a 0. If the number is a 1, then the number that it represents counts. If the number is a 0, then the number that it represents does not count. So, by manipulating the 1s and the 0s in the octet, you can come up with a range from 0 to 255. So for example, the first octet in this IP address is 66. So how do we get a binary number out of 66? First, you look at the octet chart, and you would put ones under the numbers that would add up to the total of 66. So you would put a 1 in the 64 slot. So now you already have 64, so we need 2 more. So let's put a number 1 in the 2 slot. So now if we count all the numbers that we have ones underneath them, you would get a total of 66. All of the other bits would be zeros, because we don't need to count them since we already have our number. So this number here is the binary bit version of 66. So we'll put that number down here. So let's do the next number, which is 94. So let's put a 1 under 64, 16, 8, 4, and 2. So if we were to add all the numbers that we have ones underneath them, we would get a total of 94. And since we don't want to count any of the other numbers, we just put zeros under the rest. So the next number is 29. So let's put a 1 under 16, 8, 4, and 1. And when you add all the numbers up, you get 29. And our last number is 13. So let's select 8, 4, 1, and when you add those up, you get 13. When the internet was first developed, programmers didn't realize how big it would become. They thought that IP version 4, which produced over 4 billion addresses, would be enough. But they were wrong. IP version 6 is the next generation of IP addresses. The main difference between IP version 4 and IP version 6 is the length of the address. The IP version 4 address is a 32-bit numeric address, whereas IP version 6 is a 128-bit hexadecimal address. Hexadecimal uses both numbers and alphabets in the address. So with this type of address, IP version 6 can produce an unbelievable 340 undecillion IP addresses. That's the number 340 with 36 digits after it. So as you might have guessed, IP version 6 is more than enough for the foreseeable future. So as stated before, IP version 6 is a 128-bit hexadecimal address. It's made up of 8 sets of 16 bits, with the 8 sets separated by colons, as you can see here. So in a similar way that we converted an IP version 4 address to a binary number, this is how we convert a binary number to a hexadecimal address. In an IP version 6 IP address, each hexadecimal character represents 4 bits. So we have to convert 4 bits at a time to get one hexadecimal character. So starting from the beginning, we convert the first 4 bits and put those bits up there against our 4-bit chart, which includes an 8, 4, 2, and a 1. So if we count the numbers that we have ones underneath them, you wind up with a 2. So a 2 is the first hexadecimal character in this IP version 6 address. So let's do the next 4 bits and put those under our 4-bit chart. So if we count all the numbers that we have ones underneath them, we have a 4 and a 2. And if we add those up, we get 6. So a 6 is the second hexadecimal character in this IP address. So let's do our next set of 4 bits. And if we add all the numbers that we have ones underneath them, we get a total of 13. But the problem is, since 13 is a double-digit number, we cannot use a double-digit number to represent 4 bits. And that's because in a hexadecimal format, double-digit numbers have to be represented with a single alphabet, which is A through F. So in this case, we have to use another chart for any 4 bits that the sum is 10 or higher. So in this chart up here, if the sum was 10, then we would use the letter A. Or if the sum was 11, then we would use a B. But in this case, our sum is 13. So now for the third character in our binary number, we would put a D. So in our last example, let's do the 4th set of bits. And if we add those up, we get 11. So we have a double-digit character again, which means that we have to convert it to a single character alphabet. So if we look at our chart up here, 11 converts to a B. So the first 16 bits of this binary IP version 6 address converts to the hexadecimal address as 26DB. As stated previously, an IP address has 2 parts. One part is designated for the network, and the remaining is designated for the host. So the way to tell which portion belongs to either the network or the host is where the subnet mask comes in. A subnet mask is a number that resembles an IP address. It reveals how many bits in the IP address are used for the network by masking the network portion of the IP address. So in this subnet mask, the first 2 octets are 255. So if we were to look at this subnet mask in binary form, the first 2 octets would be all ones, because when you count all the numbers in an octet, it will equal 255. Now let's go ahead and add our IP address with its binary form. So the way to tell which portion of this IP address is the network portion is when the subnet mask binary digit is 1, it will indicate the position of the IP address that defines the network. So we'll cross out all the digits in the IP address that line up with the ones in the subnet mask. And when you do this, it will reveal that the first 2 octets are the network portion, and the remaining is the host portion. Here is a chart of the default subnet masks for a class A, B, and C IP addresses. Notice the change of the locations of the network and host portions between them. You should memorize these default subnet mask classes. IP addresses are assigned to different organizations and blocks, and these blocks are divided into 5 classes. But for the exam, you only need to know 3 of them. They are Class A, Class B, and Class C, and you can tell by the number in the first octet which class an IP address belongs to. So a Class A IP range is from 1 to 126. This class supports 16 million hosts on 126 networks. This class is mainly given to large organizations because of the tremendous amount of IP addresses it can give out. And a Class B IP range is from 128 to 191, and this class supports 65,000 hosts on 16,000 networks. This class is given to medium-sized organizations. And a Class C IP range is from 192 to 223. This class supports 254 hosts on 2 million networks. And this class is given to small organizations. You're also going to need to memorize the default subnet masks for each of these classes. Now if you notice, we skipped over the 127 range. And that's because this number cannot be used for a network, because the number 127 address is reserved for internal loopback functions. Public IP addresses are publicly registered on the Internet, which basically means that if you have a public IP address, you have access to the Internet. But private IP addresses are different. A private IP is not publicly registered, so you cannot directly access the Internet with a private IP. So for example, let's say you have a small business and you need 10 public IP addresses so your employees can access the Internet. Now you could contact your ISP and ask them for these additional IP addresses, but that would be very expensive and unnecessary. So that's where private IP addressing comes in. In private IP addressing, you can create these 10 private IP addresses and just have one publicly registered IP address from your ISP. These 10 private IPs would then be translated into the one public IP so your employees can have access to the Internet. This not only saves money, but it also helps prevent having a shortage of public IP addresses. The RFC-1918 standard created private IP addressing to prevent a shortage of public IP addresses available to ISPs and subscribers. Private IP addresses are typically used on local networks such as homes, schools, and businesses. And these private IP ranges have three classes. Class A starts with the number 10, Class B starts with the number 172, and Class C starts with the number 192. The word subnet is short for subnetwork, which means a smaller network within a larger one. Subnetting is basically breaking down a large network into smaller networks or subnets. It's mainly done to make your network more manageable. So for example, let's say you have a company with 3,000 employees, and your ISP assigned you with a Class B IP address with a default subnet mask. So as you know from a previous lesson, a Class B IP address will allow you approximately 65,000 IPs for all your computers. Now you could put all of your employees in one large network, and if you had a small business, then this would be fine. But if you had a fairly large business with, for example, 3,000 computers, then this could be a problem because of traffic issues caused by so many broadcasts. And if a problem were to occur, it'll be very hard to pinpoint on one large network. Or in another scenario, what if your business was scattered into 3 different geographical locations? Then this would also be a problem. So a better way would be to break down your network into smaller ones or subnets. Subnetting is basically done by changing the default subnet mask by borrowing some of the bits that were designated for hosts and using them to create subnets. So a default Class B subnet mask is 255.255.0.0. The first 2 octets are for the network. The last 2 octets are designated for hosts. So let's say we want to break down this network into 3 smaller ones. The formula we would use is 2 to the n power minus 2, where n equals the number of bits we need to borrow from the host portion of the subnet mask. So we need to make a custom subnet mask that is equal to at least 3 subnets or larger. So if we put 2 in the place of n, then 2 times 2 equals 4, minus 2 equals 2. So 2 is not going to work because we need at least 3 subnets. So let's try 3 and see if that works for us. So 2 times 2 times 2 equals 8, and 8 minus 2 would equal 6. So borrowing 3 bits will give us 6 subnets, which will be fine because we need at least 3 subnets. So our new custom subnet mask is 255.255.224.0, which will give us 8,000 hosts per subnet. And now our network is broken down into 3 subnets. Every computer on the network has to have an IP address for communication purposes, and there are 2 ways that a computer can be assigned an IP address. It can be done either by using a dynamic IP or a static IP. A dynamic IP is where a computer gets an IP address automatically from a DHCP server. DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. A DHCP server automatically assigns a computer with an IP address. And in addition to an IP address, it can also assign a subnet mask, default gateway, and a DNS server. Here we have the TCP/IP properties window open for the network interface card on a Windows machine. And as you can see, this computer is set to obtain an IP address automatically. So when you choose this option and press OK, the computer will send out a request for an IP address. Then the DHCP server will assign an IP address from its pool and deliver it to the computer. Dynamic IP addressing is the best choice because it makes managing a network a lot easier. You can also assign a computer with an IP address manually, and this is called a static IP. A static IP is where a user manually assigns an IP address for the computer, so there is no need for a DHCP server. And this kind of IP addressing is also known as permanent, because unlike dynamic addressing, where the IP address can change automatically, a static IP only changes if the user decides to. When a computer is set to automatically obtain a dynamic IP address, it gets the IP from a DHCP server. But what happens if this computer cannot reach a DHCP server? For instance, what happens if the DHCP server goes down, or if the connection to the server is lost? If this happens, then the computers that are running Microsoft Windows 98 or later, the computer itself will assign its own IP address. This IP address will be in the 169.254.0.0 network. And this type of self-assigned addressing is called API-PA, which stands for Automatic Private IP Address Assignment. Computers running Microsoft Windows 98 or later do this so they can still be able to communicate with other computers on the same network that also have self-assigned IP addresses. If a DHCP server later becomes available, the computer changes its IP address to one that's obtained from a DHCP server. A DHCP server assigns IP addresses to computers on a subnet from its scope. Now, a scope is a group and a range of consecutive IP addresses for computers that automatically gets their IP address from a DHCP server. So for example, here we see a scope of IP addresses from a DHCP service that's built into a Netgear router. The range starts with this IP address and ends with this IP address. These values can be customized to either increasing or decreasing the range. If you wanted a computer on your network to have a specific IP address all the time, you can create a reservation on the DHCP server. A reservation ensures that a specific computer or device identified by its MAC address will always be given the same IP address when that computer accesses the DHCP server. So for example, on this router, if I create a reservation for my computer, the DHCP service on the router will recognize my MAC address and will always give me this specific IP address. Reservations are not typically given to regular computers. They are typically given to special devices or computers, such as network printers and servers that require using the same IP address constantly. When computers obtain an IP address from a DHCP server, the DHCP server assigns the IP address as a lease. So the computer doesn't actually own the IP address. It's actually a lease. And a lease is the amount of time an IP address is assigned to a computer. The lease duration could be a day or more, depending upon the lease settings of a DHCP server. So for example, if I do an ipconfig/all in a command prompt on my computer, you can see that the DHCP service on my router has assigned my computer an IP address with a lease of 1 day. Typically, a DHCP server will automatically renew the IP address for you. So you won't have to do anything or even notice that the IP address is being renewed. You can just continue on like normal and go about your business. As stated previously, when a computer needs an IP address, it will broadcast its request to a DHCP server. And if a DHCP server is on the same subnet as the computer, in other words, if they are using the same IP address settings, then the DHCP server will receive the request and assign the computer an IP address. However, if the computer and the DHCP server are not on the same subnet, in other words, they are not using the same IP address settings, then the DHCP server will not receive the request, because broadcasts cannot go outside their own subnet. So that's where a DHCP relay comes in. A DHCP relay or IP helper is a service that is enabled on a router that will relay a DHCP broadcast it receives and forwards it. So now, the computer will broadcast a request for an IP address, and once the DHCP relay on the router receives the broadcast, it will forward the broadcast to the DHCP server, and then the DHCP server will send the IP address back to the computer. Transmission Control Protocol is one of the main protocols used in a TCP/IP network. Now this is a connection-oriented protocol, which basically means that it must first acknowledge a session between the two computers that are communicating. And it does this by using a three-way handshake. The first step is that a computer will send a message called a SYN, S-Y-N. Then the receiving computer will send back an acknowledgement message telling the sender that it has received the message. And finally, the sender computer sends another acknowledgement message back to the receiver. And once this has taken place, data can be delivered. Another important thing to remember about TCP is that it guarantees the delivery of the data. So if a data packet goes astray and doesn't arrive, then TCP will resend it. Now UDP is very similar to TCP. UDP is also for sending and receiving data, but the main difference is that UDP is connectionless, which means that it does not establish a session and does not guarantee data delivery. So when a computer sends their data, it doesn't really care if the data is received at the other end. And that's why UDP is known as a fire and forget protocol, because it sends data and it doesn't really care what happens to it, as this demonstration will show. Another point to remember is that because of the less overhead that's involved of not guaranteeing data delivery, UDP is faster than TCP. FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol, and this is the standard protocol that is used by web users to upload and download files between computers through the internet. So if a user wanted to make their files available to download to other users, all they would have to do is simply upload their files to an FTP server, and then a user can simply download them. Now, there are a few ways to transfer files using FTP. You can use your standard internet browser, or you can use special FTP software. It is also important to note that FTP is a connection-oriented protocol that uses TCP for file transfer. TFTP stands for Trivial File Transfer Protocol, and this is a very simple transfer protocol. It is not used to transfer files over the internet like FTP does. It's mainly used for transferring files within the same network, and it does not provide any security during the transfer. And unlike FTP, that uses the TCP protocol for file transfer, TFTP is a connectionless protocol that uses UDP as its transfer protocol. Now, secure FTP is just like FTP, except that it adds a layer of security. The data using secure FTP is actually encrypted using secure shell during data transfer. So no sensitive data like passwords are sent in clear text. SMTP stands for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. Now this, as you might have guessed, is the protocol that is used to send email. A good way to remember this is by looking at the acronym SMTP and translating that to sending mail to people. SMTP uses the TCP protocol, and as you know by now, it is connection-oriented. So if an email you send does not reach its destination, you'll get that familiar mail delivery error in your mailbox, informing that the email you sent failed. Where SMTP is used for sending email, POP3 is the protocol that is used for receiving email. Whenever an email arrives at your mail server, you can retrieve it using the POP3 protocol and download it to your computer. The main characteristic about POP3 is that all it does is grab the email from the mail server and downloads the email to your computer. It does not sync any email or folders from the mail server and your computer like IMAP4 does, which we'll talk about next. It strictly downloads the email. And typically when your email application using POP3 retrieves the email from the mail server, the email is removed from the mail server, unless you specify in your email application to keep a copy on the mail server. POP3 is commonly used with email applications such as Microsoft Outlook. IMAP4 is another protocol that is used for receiving email. IMAP4 is similar to POP3 because they are both used for retrieving email from a mail server, but IMAP4 has better features. With IMAP4, you can access and manage your email on the server from your local computer. So if you wanted to read your email and keep a copy of it on the server, IMAP4 will allow you to do just that. And unlike POP3, IMAP4 syncs your email and your email folders from the mail server with your computer. And IMAP4 is also commonly used with Microsoft Outlook. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Now this is probably the most widely used protocol in the world today. HTTP is the protocol that is used for viewing web pages on the internet. So when you type in a web address, for example google.com, you'll notice that HTTP is added at the beginning of the URL. And this indicates that you are now using HTTP to retrieve this web page. In standard HTTP, all information is sent in clear text. Now normally this would be okay if you were just browsing regular websites. But if you were at a website where you had to enter sensitive data, such as passwords or credit card information, then this would be a problem as far as security. HTTPS stands for Secure Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and this is HTTP with a security feature. HTTPS encrypts the data that is being retrieved by HTTP. So for example, if you wanted to go to your bank's website to check your account, you will notice that an S will be added to the HTTP in the web URL. And this indicates that you are now using HTTPS and have entered a secure website where sensitive data is going to be passed, and that data needs to be protected. Some other examples where HTTPS is used would be like email servers or e-commerce websites. Telnet is a terminal emulation program that is used to access remote servers. It's a simple tool that runs on your computer, and it will allow you to send commands remotely. And because it only sends commands and not graphics, it's very fast. But the drawback is that it's not secure. All commands are sent in clear text. So today, Telnet is mainly used to access devices within a local network and not on the internet. Now, SSH or Secure Shell is a better alternative to Telnet. Secure Shell protects the data from being attacked or stolen as it's being transferred over a network. So for example, if you were sending sensitive data like a login and password, a potential hacker could be listening and steal the data. And that's the reason for Secure Shell. Secure Shell acts like a secure tunnel that forms around the data transfer and protects it from potential threats. ARP stands for Address Resolution Protocol, and this is a protocol that is used to resolve IP addresses to MAC addresses. Whenever a computer needs to communicate with another computer on the network, it needs the MAC address for that computer. So for example, let's say a computer wants to communicate with another one. Now it will first look at its internal list called an ARP cache to see if the targeted computer's IP address already has a matching MAC address in its table. Now if it doesn't, it will send out a broadcast message out on the network asking which computer has the IP address. And the computer that has the matching IP address will respond back informing that it has the IP it's looking for. Then the original computer will ask for their MAC address, and then once it receives it, the communication will take place between the two. Now let's go ahead and see a demonstration of this. Now this is called RARP, which stands for Reverse Address Resolution Protocol. And as you might have guessed, this is just the opposite of ARP. It's used to resolve MAC addresses to IP addresses. NTP stands for Network Time Protocol, and this is an internet standard that is used to synchronize the clocks of computers with the U.S. Naval Observatory master clocks. This protocol runs on each computer, and it sends out periodic requests to the server to make sure the time is in sync. SCP stands for Secure Copy Protocol, and this protocol simply uses secure shell to safeguard data as it's being transferred over a network. And this is called Simple Network Management Protocol, and this is a protocol used for network management. It's basically used for collecting data from various network devices, such as routers, printers, and servers. When data is sent over the internet to your computer, it needs to know how to accept it. And your computer accepts this data using ports. And these ports are categorized by two protocols, TCP and UDP. Now, a port is a logical connection that is used by programs to exchange information. And these ports have a unique number that identifies them. The number ranges from 0 to 65535, but for the exam, you only need to know a few of them. So here is a chart of the ports that you need to know for the exam. Some of these ports are very common and are used every single day, such as port 80, which is used for bringing up web pages on the internet. Another one is port 443, which is used for logging into secure web pages that require a login and password. And another common one is port 25, and this is used for sending email from an email application such as Microsoft Outlook. DNS stands for Domain Name System. Now this resolves domain names to IP addresses. In the world of networking, computers don't go by names like humans do. They go by numbers. So if you type in a web address in your web browser, DNS will transform the name to a number, because all computers know are numbers. So for a demonstration, when you type in yahoo.com in your web browser, the DNS server will search through its database to find a matching IP address for that domain name. And when it finds it, it will transform that domain name to the IP address of the Yahoo web server. So DNS basically works like a phone book. When you want to find a phone number, you don't look up the number first. You look up the name first. Then it will give you the number. Now WIN stands for Windows Internet Name Service, and this is used on NetBEUI networks. This service is similar to DNS, and as you recall, DNS resolves domain names to IP addresses, but WINS resolves NetBIOS names or computer names to IP addresses. So if you wanted to communicate with another computer on the same network, you would do so by using the computer's name, and then the WIN server will resolve the name to the IP address of that computer. This is called Network Address Translation, or NAT, and this is a service that is typically used in routers. And this is used to translate a set of IP addresses to another set of IP addresses. So for example, here we have a private network, and it's using a set of private IP addresses internally. Over here we have the router with its public IP address, and this router is running the NAT service. If a computer in this network wanted to communicate over the internet, it needs to translate its private IP address to the internet's public IP address. And this goes both ways. If a computer on the internet wants to communicate with a computer on this private network, then the public IP address needs to be translated to the private IP address for that computer. Another version of network address translation is called PAT, which stands for Port Address Translation. Now this translates IP addresses based on port numbers. Each computer in a private network is issued not only a unique IP address, but they are also issued a unique port number. This is done so that external data packets from the internet knows which computer on the private network it wants to talk to. So for example, if a device outside this network wanted to communicate with a computer on this private network, the IP address along with its port number will be translated by PAT to find the correct computer. SNAT stands for Static Network Address Translation. And as you recall from a previous lesson, NAT translates a private network's IP addresses to a public IP address. So in this example here, these private IP addresses will be translated to this one single public IP address, and vice versa. So what SNAT does is that it can link a public IP address with a private IP address permanently. And this is useful when a computer or server needs to be accessed from outside the network. For example, if one of these devices here was a mail server. Now, a proxy service is similar to your web browser. Whenever you look at a web page, your web browser will store that web page into cache. So at a later time, if you were to look at that web page again, your browser retrieves it much faster because it doesn't have to download the contents of that web page all over again, since it's already stored in your computer. And a proxy server does the same thing. So for example, if a company uses a proxy server,